Hello, welcome. My name is Elise Gonzalez, and I'm the Assistant Director and Curator of Exhibitions at the Art, Design, and Architecture Museum at UC Santa Barbara. Welcome. Thank you again for joining us. We'll be discussing the topic of advancement through a range of questions and themes, and many of which we'll be addressing through the lens of diversity. And just as a reminder, AAMC defines diversity very broadly by nation, gender, race, ethnicity, ability, and socioeconomic background, fields of expertise, types of organizations, and geographic locations. I also want to remind everyone that we'll be discussing this topic for an hour with an additional 15 minutes for questions. But please feel free to submit your questions throughout this webinar. We're happy to address them as they come up, or to save them at the end if that's better for you all. But just know that we are eager and ready to hear your questions. So with that, let's start with our first discussion question, which is, how does one approach telling their story, and how can they ensure their story is being heard and valued to secure their advancement? Can you share an example of when this did or did not work?
I'm happy to begin, but I want to just double check that you can all hear me okay. I've been having some audio issues.
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. I'm Rich Assey. I'm coming to you live from San Antonio from the McNay Art Museum, first modern art museum in all of Texas. Thank you, AAMC, for this opportunity. Thank you for giving me an excuse to clean up my office. I hope I did an okay job. This is such a great question. And I want to give it a specific example. When I was interviewing for this position, for the director of the McNay about 3 years ago, I started telling my story by beginning with who I am and what I stand for. And I had just completed a core values exercise. And I was in the process of going through the CCL program, Center for Curatorial Leadership. We had done a similar exercise. You begin with 50 or 100 core values, and then you slowly start fishing through the pile and compiling a hierarchy of the ones that really resonate with you in priority order. And I just printed it this morning, I printed out my core values in priority order, and I handed them to every member of the search committee and shared with them what I'm about and what I stand for. And when they asked toward the end of the interview if there's any reason I wouldn't take the position, I said, if anything on this page, if any of my core values don't align with your own. And I think that really cleared the air for what's important to me, and leaving them with something tangible when I left the room so that the conversation could continue about what this person really cares about.
That's a great example. I'll chime in. Regina Smith with the Kresge Foundation. I think just to piggyback off of something that Rich noted is that being authentic is important. I think his example really illustrates the moment in time to kind of show up in a very authentic and creative way, quite frankly, that allows those that you're presenting to really kind of see you in a different light. I also think that it's important to demonstrate over time that you both have the skill and the will to do the job at the next level, and specifically highlighting both the streets as well as the areas that you may identify that you need support or that you need to improve. But it's the skill and the will piece that I think has been really important to demonstrate over time that it's not just doing a one great project or project and then kind of expecting to be elevated at that point. It's really kind of, again, that over time piece that's really important.
Hi, I'm Karen DeTemple, and I'm the co-founder of a consulting company called The Art of Change, and it's an honor to be here today. Thank you. I'm going to piggyback on what Richard and Regina have to say. When I start out telling my story, I start with like a broad life mission that incorporates all of who I am in the art world and my personal world. And I also happen to be a yoga teacher. So I start with that broader frame. And then depending on who the audience is, then I narrow down what my story is given the audience. And then to highlight what Regina said, I also think it's very important to be open and honest and vulnerable in your story, and incorporating, you know, the values that Richard pointed out, because we are all starting to be in a better place now about open, honest communication, and that vulnerability piece is quite key as well.
And this is Catherine Armstrong, but everybody calls me Kat. I am here today as a search consultant. I'm one of the leaders of our arts and cultural practice here at Russell Reynolds Associates, and spend most of my time working with museums and other arts-related organizations, particularly on leadership transitions, and most specifically executive leadership transitions. So partnering with senior teams, as well as with boards of trustees in navigating recruitment of individuals into executive leadership roles and directorships. And I think that the points that my fellow panelists have touched on ring very true from that experience, and particularly from working with boards and helping them engage with candidates coming from all different levels of experience and different types of roles within the museum field. And I think one of the dynamics that we've seen, and that I often work with candidates on, and helping them tell their story, particularly in thinking about the transition into a first directorship, is a combination of what one has done, how one has done it, and why one has done it. So giving a sense of your theory of practice, what motivates you in what you do, how you work with teams, how you bring others into your process, what drives you, the passion behind that. Of course, in thinking about any move into an executive leadership role, we will be a critical aspect for a CEO, a director, or a board to evaluate. And then being able to give a range of examples to ground that experience, to demonstrate how that competency, as it were, has played out in different situations. And those situations don't always need to be things that have gone perfectly. I often find that hearing reflection on the challenges that one has faced and how you worked through those, the outcomes that you achieved, and how you brought others into that process can, particularly for boards, be one of the most effective tools to show not only that vulnerability, which is important, that self-awareness, which is so critical, but also the ability to flex and be a nimble and responsive problem solver and decision maker.
I also want to add, I think it's great to have a cat, like to have someone in your life, like a cat, or Richard, the program that you went through, to have a mentor to help you craft your story and to practice it and to rehearse it and to get feedback on it is extremely helpful as well. To have that mentorship through your entire career, and your mentors can come and go and change depending on where you are in your field. But that critical feedback is so key to learning how to craft your story too.
This is great, thank you. So following up on this, telling your story, what are some of the biggest mistakes you all have seen people make in telling their stories? And what are the best practices for sharing successes and goals, which you begin to allude to, Kat, and appreciate hearing more about that. And how can we do that without appearing as though we're bragging?
Share one of many, but I think the biggest pitfall when you're telling a story is forgetting who's in the room and who you're speaking to. And we have personal accomplishments that we're very proud of, and at the expense of the conversation in the room, we'll often go in that direction and really overlook the role or the responsibilities of the position that you're interviewing for and discussing. I was very proud of the fact that I had a non-traditional career path, and when I interviewed for a curatorial position, it was a curatorial fellow at the Frick Collection maybe 20 years ago, I talked all about my diverse background and spending time in different fields, majoring in psychology, making myself a very well-rounded person. The position at the table was about advancing scholarship and focusing on works in the collection. I spent 2 minutes on that. I could have spent the entire hour talking about that, but I was prouder of these other accomplishments that weren't really relevant. So I left the room and they had so little to go by for how I was the right fit. I didn't give them a chance.
I'll just try to, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Karen.
I was going to say, in my consulting business, we focus on fundraising, marketing, VIP relations. So we work with nonprofits and in the for-profit sector in the art world. So again, building on what Richard said, we've had to learn about who our audience is. So if I'm sitting in front of, a potential client that's an art fair, I'm not going to get all in on all my fundraising experience. I'll touch on that. And if I'm sitting in front of, a nonprofit, I'm not going to talk all about my VIP art fair. So I've had to learn again, as we all have, to be very nimble and what Richard was saying and who the audience is. And the bragging, we call it a humble bragging. We have to brag about ourselves, not in a, in a negative kind of way, but we have to feel confident and be able to talk about our accomplishments and our failures, as Kat pointed out. I mean, I often talk about projects that didn't work well for my consulting company because I learned from those failures that those types of clients aren't going to be a good fit for my practice going forward. So it's almost like we have a toolbox in front of us, and we have to be able to pull from our toolbox all of our different stories to put together the story for who's sitting at the seat in front of us at that moment.
I would just build on that and emphasize, I think this is a theme that likely will continue to reoccur in the conversation today, as it has in our operation, which is around transparency and vulnerability. We touched on that a little bit, but I think one of the things that we often observe in interview settings when thinking about this moment of telling one story, and often you have 1 hour to tell the story of who you are and why ostensibly you're right for a role, and that you may be one of many candidates. And I think it can be tempting, completely understandably, almost human nature, to go into pitch mode. Here's why I'm right for the job. And that at times is totally appropriate. And also, I think particularly when working with boards, they will want to know how best to support someone in being successful. No one is ever going to come into a job with 100% of the toolkit and perfect strength. There will always be areas for development, areas where one will need support to be successful. And being able to show that self-awareness, that sense of kind of honesty and transparency and vulnerability around where one might have been given feedback in terms of areas to improve, or where one might need support to be successful, I think shows a level of kind of maturity in terms of understanding one's skill set that can be very compelling. I've definitely been in situations where search committees have felt a little bit off-put by feeling like they're being pitched on someone's fit versus having a really honest conversation about whether the fit both ways is really right. So I think that willingness, when asked about a challenge that you faced or a mistake that you've made, to really honestly kind of step into the sharp edges of that conversation and be honest about it, versus saying, common response that we hear when asked about areas for development, people tell me I work too hard or things like that. Very, very true. But I think that self-awareness is great to show, and that authenticity comes through very strongly in an interview context.
Yeah, I would piggyback on everything that my fellow panelists have said. I would add that it's the rambling, I think, that is kind of a death nail relative to kind of a big mistake for me. It's like, if you can clearly articulate kind of it's summarizing your accomplishments, but also hitting the challenges that may have helped you learn how to improve in certain areas. Knowing your audience is absolutely clear, and critical, but I also think is knowing a little bit about the organization that you're applying to, doing your homework, so that there are often assumptions, at least in my case, of individuals applying for to a foundation job, and there's this notion of what we do, and it might be helpful to kind of ask someone that is already in the field for a bit of information, learning a little bit about what we do, not just online, but just kind of writ large. But it's helpful to do all of that and prepare. if you need to work with someone, a coach or a friend who will tell you the truth, whether you like it or not, that you're hitting your marks and your comments and you're clear. If those are the types of things that might be helpful, coming up with 3 bullet points that will help you summarize and focus your comments, that those are the types of things that I would strongly encourage folks to do.
And I want to build on that too, what Regina just said. A lot of times we're so in pitch mode that we not once mention the mission or the vision or the values of the organization. And it may feel very heavy-handed on your part as the interviewee, but sometimes on the other end, we're just waiting for that moment where you're going to provide the connection between you being the right person and us being the right organization. And I've been pitched a lot in these last 3 years where I felt that that pitch could have been cut and pasted into any organization, not only in the city, but in the country. And there was nothing really special about having that conversation here at the museum. So there's a lot of pride on our side of the table, and we're looking forward to hearing why someone is so excited and why this is the right place for them at the right moment.
I will just chime in and mention something that actually Kat, one of your colleagues, told me a while, 2 or 3 years ago, which is that when you are telling your story within an institution that you're already in and that you want to advance in, that it's always good to remind everybody what you've done. Because even though you've been in an institution for 10 years, you've probably done these different things with different individuals, and maybe the board doesn't know anything about what you've achieved. So it's just always good to kind of keep that running tally of what you've done and make sure to articulate that, even to people you've known for years, because they forget, or maybe they didn't even know. And so just always making sure that you're keeping tabs on your story and making sure that it sticks with you as you go along in your career. Now, in terms of the third question, I'm wondering, how do we manage advancement in an inclusive and open way? As a staff member, as a manager, to all with the goal of encouraging diversity.
Can you hear me okay? I came to the museum because the mission statement is a very inclusive one. So I knew there was a sincere commitment to diversity here at the McNay. It was rewritten in 2014, and the mission statement calls on engaging absolutely everyone. And I realized when I got here that the leadership team was made up of 3 individuals and the director. And I said early on that the smartest person in the room is the room. So we want to expand the table on those major leadership team decisions and bring more diverse voices. And currently, there are 9 of us instead of 4 on the leadership team. 3 are Hispanic, and so 1/3 of our team is Hispanic. The city is 2/3 Hispanic. So we're not there yet. Our goal is to look on the inside like our city looks on the outside, but we're going in that great direction. So for us, what's been successful is flattening the organization and hearing from different departments and having different representations in those top decisions.
Yeah, I propose to get clear about your leadership's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And specifically, I think the hiring practices and the approaches to advancement really stem from the values, the culture, and the mission of the organization, which obviously stem from its leaders. But it's also about the culture, and the values are not exclusive to those sitting in the C-suite. It's leadership can exist throughout the organization, should exist throughout the organization, and it's not just about one person. Leadership, as they say, is a practice, not a position. And so I think you have to commit to reassessing the talent that exists within the organization when those opportunities come up, and really think about different ways of conducting a search. Maybe it's a staggered search. Maybe there's an internal opportunity for those within the organization to express their interests, to really kind of surface those, the unknown talent that may be, that may exist within our organizations, and then posting in diverse and non-traditional sources. And it's something that I'm certain that Kat is very familiar with, but it's we have to really think beyond what we have traditionally done in terms of hiring practices.
I couldn't agree more. And just building on that, I think something that we're seeing a lot of organizations rigorously interrogate in themselves, which I think is so critical, is also implicit bias in search processes and in search committee dynamics. And by search committee, I don't just mean boards and thinking about directors, but also groups of team members within organizations that may be kind of leading the process of identifying and evaluating talent for roles. I think we've all been a part of conversations where there can be at times, I think, an over-reliance on credentialing and kind of the check boxes that we see as kind of yielding the right resume or things like that. And also, particularly as roles, I think, in more executive levels within organizations require a lot of external leadership responsibility, a problematic over-reliance on words like executive presence and charisma and these terms that are deeply inherently biased. And I think going into a hiring process at all different levels within an organization with a very intentional conversation, laying the groundwork about the implicit biases that we want to be very mindful of and how we can start to call those out and really hold each other accountable, and giving each other as colleagues and team members really explicit permission to have those hard conversations and raise those red flags when they appear, I think is just really important. It can be easy for people, if it comes up later in a process, to start getting defensive. And I think calling that out from the beginning and proactively saying, this is how we're going to be mindful of our own biases, and these are specific ways we're going to hold ourselves accountable, is really important.
Can you hear me okay? We've actually brought in people to give us a report card on how we're doing. So we invited, for example, we worked with AAM, the American Alliance of Museums, and brought in their Director of Diversity, Nicole Ivey, to come and speak with our staff, speak with our docents, the frontline staff, to make sure the message is very clear of how inclusive the museum is. We also brought in Holland Cotter from the New York Times to talk about the future of museums and their sustainable commitment to inclusion and to diversity. And on a lighter note, we brought in the Guerrilla Girls, an activist group that started in the 1980s to tell us how we're doing. What's our report card? 30 years later, are we representing our communities properly on our walls and in our galleries? We've had initial success these last 3 years, and going back to some comments earlier about sustainability, what funders have been looking to us for is a sustained commitment to diversity. And so that began with a heightened emphasis in our programming, in our exhibitions, but also diversifying our permanent collections and diversifying who we bring in our programming. And because of that, we just received the AAMD Diversity Internship Award, one of 14 museums, expressly because of the direction we're going in, but we hadn't received it before because there was almost a wait and see. A mission statement is very noble and it's very aspirational, but how are you applying that in your daily practice?
Thank you. Before too long, we have a few questions that have come in, and most have been referencing the question we just talked about previously. And those questions revolve around the idea of, if you are within an institution, what is the best way to continue to tell your story so that you can advance within that institution? And we already touched on this a bit, but can you all offer your insights on how one can do that?
Well, I can speak to my experience at the Brooklyn Museum, where I was before coming here. And when I was at that pivot point between a curator and a managing curator overseeing, the next step would have been overseeing my peers, 7 curators who were in my fellow department. I started altering my story to include not only championing the collection and the department, but championing the bigger picture, championing the museum at large, the vision of the museum, the director of the museum. And so I became almost a dual champion, always having the voice of the department, but also having the voice and the back of the institution and even board members and larger conversations. And often there was a breakdown in communication between the two, between the bigger picture and the department's needs. And so I gathered information from both sides and was very bold. I would approach at first Arnold Lehman, who was my director for 5 years, and then Ann Pasternak, and say, how can I help you? How can I help you minimize this communication breakdown? And I think often we don't ask, how can I help? And I think both lit up when they realized that I was leaning in, I had their back, but I also had the back of my department. And that's not a conflict of interest. You can have both, and you just sometimes need to be the successful conduit between the two.
I would just build on that. I think as we think about this type of question, there are two different angles that maybe we'll or one as an internal team member thinking about moving towards a promotion, how to position oneself. And then I think from the other perspective, as managers and leaders within an organization, how can we create opportunities for colleagues internally to find those opportunities and to be well positioned for them? And from that perspective, I think something that we have found in some ways almost tactically is very important within a search process at many different levels, working with internal candidates, is to give internal candidates the same benefit that external candidates have to come in and tell their story with the full breadth of their background. In other words, not to over rely on the experiences that one might have had by working with an internal candidate in one role and in a certain way. Just to give some examples, often when we're working with internal candidates, there might be a sense from the hiring team's perspective of saying, well, we know what they've done, so we're not going to ask them this question. Or I've worked with John Smith in this capacity. I already know his skills in those areas. I don't need to go there. In reality, particularly when there may be a group assessing candidates, every member of that hiring committee will have worked with a team member in a different way. And it really is unfair to privilege and over rely on those experiences when evaluating a candidate, because that doesn't happen with externals, and I think can be to the detriment of an internal candidate. So really giving those opportunities and structuring the interview process in a way that helps them have opportunities to really tell their story, I think is very important.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely important approach that, it is very different. The dynamic is extremely different. I've been through it several times. The dynamic is different relative to being an internal candidate as opposed to being an external candidate. And the approach from the individual's perspective has to be different as well. And part of it is you have to not necessarily sell yourself, but to frame your story. Because there are others who, as others have said, when you've worked with people over the course of time, a narrative already exists. So what's the narrative that you want to share about your abilities to do the job and to step into the role? How have you demonstrated your capacity and your ability to do the work? And what's your vision? Do you have a perspective around how you might lean in a way that maybe is different and unique? So what's your unique contribution to the opportunity? And so again, I think it is by far a really nerve-wracking experience to kind of go through it, but it's a learning experience as well.
It's also going back to what Richard said before. If you go through the exercise of what your core values as a person are and what your life mission as a person are when you're interviewing internally, you have a different audience sitting in front of you. And again, having an open and honest and vulnerable conversation about where you're coming from, what experiences you've had at that current institution, and why you want to move into this new position, how that serves your values, has that serves you as a human and as a career, like package it in a more global way than you might normally. Again, going back to your toolbox and pulling from the toolbox to tell your story to that audience.
Yeah, I talked to Thelma Golden once, again, going back to CCL, but she was one of our mentors during the training, and she was, and is at the Studio Museum, and she made the transition from curator to director, and she said she was really at peace with making that transition because she was as passionate about the overall vision as she once was about an exhibition or an acquisition or a specific program. And I think that's really great advice, that if you are pivoting, the higher up you go in an arts organization, the more you have as one of your responsibilities setting a vision and thinking about strategy. And I can't get out of bed if I'm not as passionate about those things as I once was about acquiring the very best Michelangelo drawing on the market. And I was very much personally at peace with that transition. And I hear others aren't always, but I was ready. I personally was ready. Now, when I was pitching being ready, I didn't talk about this being a great opportunity for my career and it's the next step because I'm ready. I talked about how there's alignment with the overall vision, and I want to help support that vision, and I want to see the organization thrive, and I want to be a part of that.
Yeah, I think it is definitely an opportunity to shift from these are my accomplishments to this is how I envision the next stage of either department or the organization, whatever the case might be. But it is a really strong pivot away from this is all about me. In other words, if the team doesn't succeed, then I don't succeed, and that is a very different posture that I think we have to encourage people to think about when they're approaching new positions.
Great, thank you. So to be thinking very broadly about an institution, and I'm just wondering as we're sitting here talking, if you, Rich, for example, haven't had the opportunity to go to CCL or to work with a career counselor, and you're just trying to get your work done, as we all are at a small nonprofit usually, or a big one even. What's the best way to figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are? And if somebody, maybe you're at an institution where people aren't giving you feedback, or feedback even that you can trust. So what's the best way to begin to understand your strengths and weaknesses and to craft and to use then that as the basis for crafting your story?
So two things come to mind. One, personality assessments. Really do a deep dive in not only your traits, but also your behaviors. Because we're born with our traits, I think they're developed by age 10 or 12, but your behaviors are how you show up at work. And there's an opportunity to really adapt. The other is mentors. Even before CCL, I felt a lot of turbulence walking up to someone who I thought was too busy and didn't really want to take the time to help someone who was their junior. And I think the first person I took a chance with was I think Arnold Lehman, and he's a born mentor. I didn't realize how much he enjoys it, and so that gave me confidence to approach other leaders in the field, and also seeing a variety of styles. When I saw different directors in action, I learned quickly that there isn't one style of leadership. There are many, and that was such a weight off my shoulders. I thought you had to be a type A, aggressive, biggest personality in the room kind of person to be successful in any leadership role at an organization. And I have to credit Adam Weinberg for being a mentor, for showing me that he's his authentic self every day. And he is not maybe the biggest personality in the room, but he's certainly someone I want to gravitate to. And I think others feel the same way. So those two, personality tests and mentors, if I can give you specifics on personality tests, DISC was really helpful. Just to even find out which one of the 4 quadrants you live in. I'm an influencer with a rising dominance. So under stress, you realize how you can adapt. Another great personality test is Strength Finders, which speaks to your strengths and focusing less on weaknesses. So at least you're asking about what you're good at. It really breaks down your top 10 strengths. And we've done it here at the McNay with the leadership team. So when we get together, initially after those results, we brought our results with us, so that when I went into a meeting, I wasn't going into a meeting with Sally, I was going into a meeting with a strategic person or a developer or someone who's a woo person. So you understand more about yourself and how you're interconnected with the team.
Yeah, I think everybody's different, and I'm not a huge fan of some of the personality tests, but I would say that both strengths finders and discs can be more useful tools than, say, 360 or Myers-Briggs. I think sometimes those blunt instruments can reinforce stereotypes, aren't necessarily encouraging and supportive of kind of ethnic and cultural distinctions and differences. And I think in that respect, that personal coaches and other mentors can be extremely powerful ways to kind of allow people to be authentic, their authentic selves, because it's important to encourage people to be who they are. And the degree to which the workplace is a constellation of people who are bringing not just their individual aspects, but their strengths and their opportunities, whatever opportunities exist to kind of get better. We should do a better job of trying to cultivate that. So again, I think it's an opportunity for us to identify peer coaches or other types of professional opportunities. It's also a great opportunity, I think, for us to have a conversation with our colleagues around what might they, where might they, and what might they really enjoy learning more about. So is it possible to sit in on a board meeting? Is that a helpful exercise, kind of the low cost, no cost opportunities, or shadowing someone or auditing a class, something along those lines that actually gives our colleagues a taste of what it might be like to be in a leadership role. So again, those are, you know, a couple of things, but I'm not a huge fan of Myers-Briggs or some of the others. I think they're blunt instruments. Could be helpful for some, but this is arts and culture. It's the arts and cultural field. We need to be a bit more creative and use other tools that we have at our disposal.
I would just add, building on that, I couldn't agree more in terms of the importance, if there is not a system of kind of more formal mentorship or kind of deep performance appraisal, which is pretty common. There's a lot of organizations that just don't have that infrastructure. When working with those more informal coaches and mentors, thinking about that kind of more informal apprenticeship model, I think asking for structured feedback can be very helpful. I think very often in an informal mentorship network, you're out over lunch, you're out over a drink, and you say, "How am I doing? I'd love your feedback." And it can be uncomfortable, particularly when there is a personal relationship involved, for people to give critical and developmental feedback. It's all too easy to just say, "Oh, well, I think you're doing really great. You know, keep doing these things," when often it's really the critical feedback, that constructive criticism when delivered in an appropriate way, that we're all really seeking. And so I think working with those informal mentors and coaches and giving them kind of a structure of the specific areas where feedback would be really most helpful, and giving that really explicit permission to say, what I'm getting at here is, how can I do better? Where can I improve? How can I go find those resources to help me get there? Sometimes can be helpful, rather than just kind of asking for feedback with that level of openness.
I'll add on that. When my business partner and I started this company 4 years ago, we went through a series of exercises that was given to us by a coach, and we talked openly and honestly. We went on a day retreat, and maybe this would work well for a team. We talked through about what we liked, what we were good at, what we didn't like to do, what we were bad at, and we had this open and honest, very day-long dialogue, you know, about tasks and things that we knew how to work well together, because we had a really good sense of what each other liked to do, didn't like to do, so that when we need to, we can divide and conquer tasks really well. And then before we start meetings, we give each other a few minutes to give each other open and honest feedback in a safe place about, yesterday in that meeting, I didn't think it was good when you said this, and It's safe, it's non-judgmental, we can talk things out, let it go, and move forward. And that's with my business partner. And then when I'm working with clients, also at the end of each call, I ask them how I can better support them, how I can better serve them, how am I helping them? So I'm always trying to engage in open and honest communication. And again, going back to, the vulnerability and being our authentic selves. It's so great. I've been in the art world for almost 30 years now, and to see the transitions of where it's all changed. And I don't know if I'm sorry if it was Kat or Regina who said, asked to sit in a boardroom. I mean, I remember when I was a young, fundraising associate, in the 90s, how daunting and intimidating it was in the boardroom. And to now that we're able to actually be able to possibly ask to see that, to attend a certain dinner or to be a part of something, to see if we're interested. It's wonderful when we have people like this in our lives that are open to these kinds of conversations because it'll enable us all to grow, and it'll enable the organization to grow and be stronger too.
Yeah, I would also say you have to also know yourself, right? So it's knowing the things that are stretch opportunities, or those things that scare you to death, right? And it's okay, I think, I think Rich was saying earlier that everyone isn't this extrovert and the come to the job with certain skills that we assume are leadership skills. And a great book that a colleague shared with me called Quiet by Susan Cain it was really liberating to read about the kind of the introverts can be leaders too. But we do it in our own way, but it's kind of knowing yourself. And so self-reflection is a really important component, I think, of the readiness quotient of how we might consider stepping into a different position.
My business partner is an introvert, so it's interesting when we're in meetings together how we're both very similar, but we're also both very different. And clients and people notice that all the time. And she's incredible and passionate too. She's just not as outgoing as I am. Like, introverts sometimes I wish I was an introvert. Like, it's all good.
We all are introverts and extroverts at different times. It doesn't matter. It's okay.
Yeah, exactly. I try to step away from a lot of labeling, but it's hard sometimes. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to encourage our audience that please feel free to submit your questions. We're happy to answer them through the conversation or at the end. So just another encouraging message to feel free to ask questions. For our next question is, what trends and needs do you see among individuals working today in terms of what they want and how they think of advancement and rewards? What do the various generations working today What do the various generations working today value that is different from the past?
I can speak to a shift that I'm seeing with the younger generations on staff. There's definitely a greater passion for purpose and cause, and how can I make a difference? And there's also at the same time a greater interest in transparency. So how we're addressing that here, and I love this shift in our zeitgeist, because now we're honoring all staff meetings and opening up conversations. I mentioned core values earlier. We didn't have core values at the McNay when I joined, and when we embarked on the process, we brought everyone into the process. Ultimately, it was blessed by the Board of Trustees, but it was initiated by the leadership team. We shared it with the staff. We had conversations with the staff, and we listened. And at one all-staff meeting, someone actually raised his hand and said, well, how do I navigate my supervisor and Rich as the director of the museum in the same way that I speak to my wife when there's a power structure in place? If you're speaking about inclusion and about all of us having a valid voice, how can I put aside the hierarchy? And I didn't have an answer at the moment, but we had a culture coach working with us, and he pulled me aside after and he said, what you're doing is creating such a healthy environment where that person felt safe enough to even ask that question and challenge the structure. And it was a very healthy approach to doing it. He said that he had witnessed, our coach had witnessed CEOs really dismiss that person from the room as something audacious and inappropriate. So I think that I personally, as a psychology major, I'm delighted that we're going in this new direction of empowerment. I think that the challenge is how transparent can we be when we have information that isn't really developed at the time, and so I don't want to share information until it's fully realized, because then we could get excited about going in one direction and it could potentially pivot. So I'm delighted about an emphasis on transparency, and I'm also very aware of the challenges with leaning into it fully.
I would just add to what Rich has said. I think the perspective that we often hear is, when working on leadership searches, spending a lot of time with staff in that process and hearing what their desires are, what their ambitions are, what their priorities are, and what they're hoping for in a new leader, and what that person will achieve both with and for them in leading an organization. And I think the transparency piece is really the number one. And it's in many ways, I think, one of the pressure points that we hear that's a real desire is not just transparency about what's going on, but why decisions are being made and how they're being reached. I think particularly for younger generations, there's a real sense of wanting to share ownership in what's happening and why an organization does what it does and where it's going, and kind of working together towards a North Star in terms of vision, and wanting to have not just that sense of what our tactics are with our strategic plan and what we're going to be doing, but why, how did we reach this decision? What's the board's role in decision making? What's the director's role in decision making? How do the senior staff participate and give input? And understanding those lines of communications in all directions, I think goes a long way in terms of people taking and feeling a sense of shared ownership. And culture is a word that I think is so important now, not just a word, but a concept. I think the old adage of museums being these very hierarchical top-down places is changing, and a sense of culture and shared ownership is just really important now, I think, for leaders at all levels within an organization, and understanding that decision-making process. It has been, the feedback we've received, a big part of that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. In terms of transparency, it's really around demystifying the process and demystifying the decision-making process. I'm also seeing a couple of other trends, and one is relative to really seeing the job description with more dotted lines around it versus solid lines, and really being able to identify both unique opportunities to showcase one's abilities, and kind of special projects. It's kind of a more expedient way to be recognized for specific projects, or to really receive, to kind of continue to add to the skill base. The other is really kind of the control and command manager role, and really wanting manager more as a coach. And I think that that trend is one that I think we've been talking a lot about today. And I think there's something that is very useful in that notion of pivoting away from the job is a job, but we spend a whole lot of time together, and the relationships are what they are, but it's I think the opportunity to go a little bit deeper as a manager, to really understand what the aspirations are of each colleague, and to kind of manage differently.
I could build on what Regina was saying about a job as a job. I think we're all moving to this place today where a job is a huge part of who we are as a person. Back to that life mission, back to who we are as a whole entire human. And we're all getting up and going to the office, whatever that means to you, every day, because we're excited about the mission of the organization. We're excited about the core values. The core values fit with our core values as a human. You know, we all want a seat at the table now, and mentorship, and we're all entrepreneurs in a way, and we want to work collectively, but we also want a lot of independence. So it's almost like a puzzle, and having all the puzzle pieces match up. So at the end, you have the beautiful, completed, finished puzzle is how I really see it all working now. And it's a beautiful thing. It's really, I love to see it all come together and all of those pieces. And what I see also with this next generation, even with myself, is a flexible schedule. To have a lot of flexibility, because maybe we aren't all morning people. Maybe we do our best work later at night. Like, again, knowing who you are and how you work best, and being able to allow people to work to their best, highest capacity is also very important.
So I have a question. If you are a young person and you have started out in this position and you value a flexible schedule, transparency, feeling part of the team and everything, and it's not already in place, all of those things, should you just leave because that's not the culture for you? Or is there a way to advocate? How can you advocate and maneuver in this environment? Are there tips and tools you can give us to negotiate those strictures and to advance them?
Well, I would say, if you're already within the organization, just start having the open, honest communication with those above you and those around you, and to start to advocate for how you work best for, whatever it is, and give it some time. If the organization perhaps has some resources, it can bring in these coaches and mentors to work with the organization. Ultimately, it has to come from the top, right, that the organization needs to make shifts and changes. And if after some time there isn't any change or an investment on behalf of the organization, then perhaps it's time for you to move on and find a culture where it is a better fit for your needs. But you have to start talking about it. We're not all the Borg. We look like the Borg right now, but we're not the Borg. Unless you talk about it and voice it and be open and honest, all the things and vulnerability, nothing's going to change.
Yeah. And in my case, it was really transparent, because when I was hired, I was during the search process, I was given some aspirations from the board on what they wanted to improve at the museum, and work culture and employee engagement was part of that, as well as visitor engagement. So I knew there was already an interest on the part of the top leadership in having us work together. You mentioned culture and a culture coach. We have a culture coach who attends all of our all-staff meetings every month. He actually runs them. He does not charge us for this because he believes in our work so much. We couldn't afford him, but I just share that with you, because when someone gets behind what you're doing and the vision that you're bringing and your commitment to improving your staff's day-to-day experience at a museum, they will forego, in some cases. We were fortunate enough to have him do that. In our case, their compensation. And he has great joy in coming here and experiencing and being a part of that transformation. So I wouldn't rule out someone just because you feel that your institution doesn't have the financial capacity.
I would also, sorry, go ahead, Tina. All right, I'll start off. I was just going to say, I think as we've been preparing for this conversation, one of the other dynamics we've been talking about, which is a really real one, is fear. And I think in this area, one of the biggest fears that one can have is a fear that if I rock the boat and give critical feedback, that I'll be penalized for that. And I don't want to be naive and say that that never happens. And we all know there are organizations where, unfortunately, that does happen. But I also think that there is a changing dynamic of leadership within a lot of arts organizations now. And there are, and I don't mean this with any respect to age, but I think a new generation of leaders who think differently about these dynamics of coaching and feedback coming into leadership roles, who want feedback, who appreciate when people come to them in the appropriate way and say, this is something that I'm observing. I think that this is something that you probably want to be aware of. And here's how I'm going to think about solutions, not just coming with problems, but saying, I'd love to help you think about how we can change this. And here's some ideas. Just to kind of give one example, I'm working with an organization right now where I think they've observed a lot of difficulty in the transition of leaders from project management when you're running big exhibitions and you're running big projects to team management and team supervision, and how you help teams develop in an ongoing capacity beyond the context of a project. And thinking about this idea of kind of a culture of feedback and having a team that's basically modeling kind of a pilot initiative to say, how can we change the culture of how we give and receive feedback in this organization? So coming to leaders, having that courage when you think when there's a receptive environment, to give that honest feedback about what could be improved, and then coming with solutions as opposed to just trying to kind of add one more thing to the plate of a director or a colleague, I think can be really valuable and really appreciated, even though it's kind of a scary conversation to have in the moment.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something similar. Is like relative to the fear is the self-reflection, and to be very honest about kind of take a step back. Is it me? Am I doing something? Am I showing up in a way that that either gives the wrong impression? Am I always the one kind of bringing up a negative comment or kind of reinforcing a particular event that happened that wasn't necessarily positive? Am I the broken record, so to speak? And am I communicating clearly? Do I go off on tangents? And I think that also might help us understand about fit. We have to honestly ask ourselves, is this the best opportunity? Can I actually excel here? If oftentimes the organizations are small, or even in some cases large institutions, where the org chart is flat, the organizational structure is relatively flat. If you can excel in that environment, again, you have to honestly ask yourself, can I excel in this environment? If the answer is no, then let's begin to look for other opportunities. If the answer is yes, then the question is, how can I strategically navigate and do so, and begin to ask hard questions and begin to look for opportunities within the organization.
Yeah, and if someone is staying and they're living in fear, then that's very heartbreaking to hear. One tool, if you're navigating fear, to go back to Kat and calling that out, a leader should recognize the person who took that bold step and challenged their own fear and questioned either the director or a supervisor. If it came from an honest place, if it came from a sincerely, we want this institution to be better place, then a leader should be open to that, should actually be very grateful for that. So I can't encourage enough all-staff meetings where everyone does get together, and I can't encourage enough setting the tone at those meetings where those questions are not only welcome, but they're actually rewarded. And I rewarded someone who challenged our core values as we were going through the process, and we called out the fact that we are committed to creating a culture of inclusion. And someone on staff who is I don't often interact with that much, in front of everyone said, I hope you walk the walk and talk the talk. I hope that you really back this up, because we're about to open a show on titled Trans America, which we just did last week, Gender Identity Appearance Today. And our community needs this exhibition. And I hope you do everything you can to make sure that it's realized to its fullest. And I seized that opportunity. One, I thanked that person, and I thanked her a few times after as well for challenging that. But two, I reminded those at that meeting that when we say inclusive, we mean everyone. And that's a difficult balance to strike when you're sometimes at a leadership team position, because you have such a big picture. You're navigating so many individuals, so many at times conflicting interests. And if the goal is to really include everyone and not targeted audiences, but make everyone feel welcome, then you really have to balance that line very carefully. So I think empathy is going to get us through this transition, this new generation. And I think that even those of us at a leadership team table need to share what life is like from our perch, so that those who are questioning have a better understanding of everything that we're navigating. I think it goes in both directions.
Thank you, Rich. We've got about 10 minutes left. And one of the questions, so please, if you have not submitted a question and would like to, feel free. You can submit anonymously. But one of the questions that we have to answer now is, how can you learn to be more flexible in working with differing styles or new leadership without needing to change your own style and preference for management?
Yeah, I think that not changing is kind of a non-negotiable. I think we all have to be willing to change. I am not an expert in this particular space. In fact, I'm a work in progress when it comes to navigating change and being really more adaptable. I think the really wonderful resource of adaptive leadership is a great book, but it's also it has wonderful tools that really suggests that we kind of take a step back. There's a great quote about getting in the balcony and kind of looking at our work and our perspectives looking at not just the work, but looking at the situation from different perspectives. So there are technical and there are both adaptive solutions to the problems that we're trying to solve. And that to me is it's been helpful to kind of think through, not just in my own career path, but in working with others, is that, we're not going to have all the answers all the time. It's important to surround ourselves with groups and teams of people who have different skill sets, but, really challenging and vexing problems really require adaptive solutions and adaptive leaders. And again, I'm a work in progress, so I can't suggest that there's a silver bullet here, but everyone needs to consider kind of change as a part of growth.
I would also add, I think something that's been very helpful to me, and also with a long, long way to go in terms of the personal journey of how to do these things well, is I think as a manager, understanding that sometimes helping people solve problems and being a good manager isn't about telling them how to do things, but empowering them to figure out how to do things, and being that coach that's very close with them, but not about kind of imposing one's own management model. There's it's actually pretty old kind of coaching model called the GROW model, which I think is very simple and is a helpful frame that I've always used. And the framework is goal, reality, options, way. And fundamentally, the model is, when working as a manager and working with a team member who may have a very different style, rather than saying, here's how I think you should do things, it is to say, so what do you want? What is your goal? What do you want to get out of this? What's the reality of where you are now? Talk to me about some options of what you could do to get there, and then the way there. So what will you actually do, and how can I help you hold yourself accountable for this? And I think those little frames for me, I think, are very helpful in empowering someone who may have a very different style to be able to use that style while still being a good manager and coach, in helping them get there and hold themselves accountable without imposing my own style.
I think also having a paradigm shift when we have a tendency to go personal when we're confronting someone who doesn't have our own style. I have a tendency to read that person as really challenging and almost insulting your own style, when in fact, the variety of styles helps us be a stronger team. And so what that person brings to the table is perhaps a weakness of someone else, and that complement is going to lead to just a stronger team altogether. I think personality tests, I'm going to go back to that. The sooner you get that intel, the better on who you're working with and who you're working with closely. And there's one in particular we didn't talk about earlier, but Culture Index I just did last week. And it can really break down the managing styles of each person you engage with frequently. And that was a revelation for me. And that was just a week ago, where I realized someone is not choosing to not align with me on purpose. It's just that that person sees the world in a very different way. And that's equally valid, and it's equally important in getting us to where we need to be. And so the sooner you can get the intel on the makeup of your individual teammates, I think the better off you're going to be.
And I think it goes back to what we've been talking about all day, for this last hour, is open and honest communication. I'm not in the position as a consultant to be a manager, but I mentor a lot of people in the industry and work with a lot. And early on, when I'm onboarding a client, I ask them, how do they work best, and spend a lot of time onboarding, so that, and I have 25 people that I'm working with as a consultant all the time. So I have to know how each individual works, much like managing a very different team with 8 different institutions. So it's all about open and honest communication. And then, I too share with them how I work best. Like, this is how it's helpful for you to communicate with me. And so and to be able to receive that feedback as well without getting defensive, which I know is so hard to do, will help serve everybody so much better. But hard. I totally meant hard.
Great, thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left, so if anybody has any questions, please feel free to send them in. One of those questions that we've received, however, is, at a certain point in your career, you've achieved a number of things. So picking and choosing highlights can be more challenging. What's the best way to hone in on the highlights to share when telling your story for a certain position or advancement within your institution?
I'll maybe just start off there. I think one of the things that I've observed a lot in trying to think through how to, in some ways going back to our first question, how to craft that narrative and how to pick those stories when one has done a lot, is actually listening first to what the organization is really navigating and the questions they're really asking, what's keeping them up at night, versus what do I want to tell. I think at times we've talked about kind of some of the perils of the pitch feel. It's very easy to say, I think these are the top 5 stories that are most impressive in my career, and I'm going to get them across. Doggone it, I'm going to tell these stories, and then get into an interview and have a colleague or a team member, a director, or board, whomever it is, feel afterwards like, well, this person's done a lot of really cool things, but I don't feel like they listened to or actually answered any of our questions or really spoke to what we really need to solve for in this role. And so I think doing that really good preparation, like we've discussed, and really thinking about what's on this organization's mind, what do they need this role to achieve, and really listening to the questions, and then being prepared to say, this might not be the most impressive example on paper, but this is the situation that I've navigated that I actually really feel best speaks to the question you're getting at. And then coming back around and saying, did I answer that question? Can I reframe that? In my observation, can be a really helpful way to hone in on the specific examples.
Yeah, I'm going to build on what Kat said and just go to the responsibilities section of the job description that you're interviewing for. And I would gloss over and say, I'm not so excited about this part. I just want to address it. But if you can address all of it, know that there was a lot of time and effort that went into those responsibilities. And it's a culmination of information shared from many constituents. And so if you can't address that, someone else is going to ask you to address it. And it's better for you to take the lead in your narrative than be caught off guard. And if you find that you're not really aligning with the responsibilities and they don't speak to you, but you're trying to force it to work, that's really not the job or the position for you. And you should save everyone time sooner rather than later.
I would also add, in addition to some of the things that we talked about earlier, and my colleagues have mentioned, just now, is that chances are, unless you're going into a very small organization, you're a team of people. And it's not as if one person has to possess all of the skills necessary to deliver on a team's aspirations or an organization's aspirations. And so it is important to focus. Again, knowing your audience, knowing the position, doing your homework, and really summarizing, if it is 5 key points or whatever, but then you really need to be 5 key points that are relevant to the job and the organization, and again, less about a pitch or how or what you want to get across. It's all about kind of focusing the comments.
Great, thank you. I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for taking the time and effort to respond to all these questions and to consider these issues, which are challenging all of us, or that we're wrestling all of us with. So thank you very much to Rich, Karen, Catherine, Regina. It's really been great to have you here and to hear your thoughts. And I want to thank you for being a part of this AAM series. And I also want to make sure to thank Judith and Monica for being so wonderful and great in organizing everything and making it all work out beautifully. So, and thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today. We really appreciated your questions, and hopefully this has been helpful to you. So thank you again and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
You.